On March 4, 2022, at 3:07 in the morning, a woman in Kamas, Utah called 911. Her husband wasn't breathing, he was cold to the touch. Kouri Richins told the dispatcher she'd found her husband Eric unresponsive in their bed. She said they'd been celebrating a Moscow mule, a real estate deal. Eric Richins was 39 years old. He left behind 3 sons, and within a year, his widow would write a children's book about grief, then face murder charges. This is a case about what happens when financial desperation meets opportunity. When a $1.6 million debt meets a $2.2 million life insurance payout. It's about a housekeeper who became an unlikely witness, and a children's book about loss written by the woman who allegedly caused it. And here's what makes this case different. Prosecutors couldn't prove how the poison entered Eric's body. Not a single witness saw it happen. They didn't need one. Eric and Kouri Richins lived in Kamas, a mountain town about 40 miles southeast of Salt Lake City. They had 3 boys. Eric worked in construction. Kouri flipped houses. From the outside, it looked like success. Nice home, growing family. A portfolio of properties. But underneath, the numbers told a different story entirely. According to forensic accountants who testified at trial, Kouri's real estate business wasn't thriving, it was collapsing. The day after Eric died, the business had a net worth of negative $1.6 million. The prosecution's case started with money. Eric Richins had multiple life insurance policies totaling approximately $2.2 million, but one policy raised immediate red flags. Prosecutors argued Kouri had applied for one policy fraudulently without Eric's knowledge. She'd signed his name, forged his consent, taken out insurance on a life she planned to take. But insurance fraud alone doesn't make a murder case. The prosecution needed to prove Eric didn't die of natural causes. The medical examiner's report would provide that answer. Eric Richins had 5 times the lethal dose of fentanyl in his bloodstream. 5 times. The medical examiner ruled it an overdose and determined the drug was illicit, ingested orally. Eric had no history of drug use, no prescription for opioids, no reason to have fentanyl in his system at all, let alone enough to kill him 5 times over. Someone gave him that poison, and investigators quickly zeroed in on the last person to prepare Eric's drink, his wife. Kouri told investigators she'd made Eric a Moscow mule that night. They were celebrating, they'd just closed on a property. She brought him the drink in bed. That was the last drink Eric Richins ever had. By 3 a.m., his wife was calling 911, but what happened in those hours between the Moscow mule and that phone call? Investigators started pulling phone records, text messages, financial documents, and 3 days after Eric's death, they found something that would become central to the prosecution's case. 3 days after her husband died, Kouri Richins texted her housekeeper. The message read, "Still have your hookup. Still have your hookup. Her husband dead for 72 hours. And she's reaching out for more drugs." That text would lead investigators to Carmen Lauber. Carmen Lauber was Kouri's house cleaner. She'd worked for the Richins family. And when called to testify, she told the jury something that changed everything. Lauber testified she sold illicit pills to Kouri Richins 4 times in early 2022, 4 separate transactions. All at Kouri's request. All in the weeks before Eric died. The defense would later argue that prosecutors couldn't prove what was in those pills. Couldn't prove they were fentanyl. Couldn't prove they ended up in Eric's drink. But prosecutors didn't need to prove every link in the chain. They needed to prove motive, opportunity, and pattern. They had all 3. Because this wasn't Kouri's first alleged attempt on her husband's life, the jury also heard evidence of what prosecutors called a failed poisoning on Valentine's Day 2022. According to prosecutors, Kouri tried to poison Eric on February 14th. He got sick. He survived. 3 weeks later, she allegedly succeeded. The timeline was devastating. Valentine's Day, sick but alive. February, transactions with Carmen Lauber. March 3rd, the Moscow mule. March 4th, the 911 call. March 7th, 3 days after Eric's death, Kouri texts her housekeeper asking about the hookup. The pattern spoke louder than any single piece of evidence. But here's where this case takes its strangest turn. A year after Eric's death, Kouri Richins appeared on television, not as a suspect, as an author. In April 2023, Kouri self-published a children's book called Are You With Me? It was about coping with grief, about losing a parent. She'd written it with her 3 sons. In an interview that April, Kouri said the writing process brought a little peace to me and my boys. She was promoting her book about losing their father, the father she allegedly murdered. Weeks later, in May 2023, Kouri Richins was arrested for the murder of her husband Eric. The book tour was over. The investigation had caught up. The arrest made national news: a grieving widow, a children's book about loss, and charges of aggravated murder. The contrast was too stark to ignore. Kouri Richins went to trial in early 2026. Prosecutors called more than 40 witnesses: forensic accountants, phone analysts, the medical examiner, Carmen Lauber. The defense mounted a simple argument: no one saw Kouri put fentanyl in Eric's drink. No one saw her administer the poison. Without that witness, how could the jury convict? It's a fair legal point. Poisoning cases are notoriously difficult to prosecute. The act happens in private. Often there's no physical evidence of administration. But the prosecution had built a circumstantial case that left little room for doubt. Financial motive: $1.6 million in debt, $2.2 million in insurance. A source: Carmen Lauber. A prior attempt: Valentine's Day. And the text message: still have your hookup, sent 3 days after her husband's death. The jury saw a pattern. Prosecutors called it premeditation. The trial lasted weeks. Both sides made their closing arguments, and on March 16, 2026, the jury retired to deliberate. 3 hours later, they had a verdict: guilty on all counts. Aggravated murder. Attempted aggravated murder for Valentine's Day. The jury found Kouri Richins responsible for her husband's death. After 3 hours of deliberation, they'd reached a unanimous decision: more than 40 witnesses, months of evidence, and a pattern that pointed to only one conclusion. Kouri Richins now faces life in prison. She can appeal, but the evidence, circumstantial as it was, proved enough to convict. So what can we learn from this case? First, digital evidence. Phone records and text messages created a timeline that witnesses couldn't provide. Still have your hookup. 3 days after her husband's death, consider how your digital communications might tell a story you never intended to write. Second, financial forensics. Investigators examined years of business records to establish motive. The $1.6 million debt told a story of desperation. Life insurance policies, especially ones taken without a spouse's full knowledge, can become evidence of premeditation. Investigators flagged the forged application early. Third, this case shows how circumstantial evidence works. No single witness saw the poisoning, but the pattern of behavior was enough for 12 jurors. Motive, opportunity, pattern, prior attempt. When those elements align, prosecutors can build cases without direct eyewitness testimony. It happens more often than you'd think. And finally, the children's book. Are You With Me? Writing about grief while allegedly responsible for causing it. That detail will stay with jurors and observers alike. The 3 Richins boys lost their father to poison and their mother to prison. Whatever Kouri's intentions with that book, her sons are the ones living with the outcome. Eric Richins was 39 years old when he died. He worked in construction. He had 3 young sons. He trusted his wife enough to drink what she made him. That trust, the everyday intimacy of sharing a drink with your spouse, became the weapon. A Moscow mule to celebrate closing on a property, the last celebration of his life. If you found this breakdown helpful, consider subscribing. We cover cases like this every week: the evidence, the investigation, the verdict. The Kouri Richins case is now closed, at least at trial level. Appeals may follow. But for Eric's family, the verdict brought something prosecutors rarely promise: answers. A Moscow mule, a children's book, and a conviction. Sometimes the strangest details are the truest. This was Case Files Explained.